Hey, welcome to our podcast for the West Chowan Baptist Association. And we are so excited to use this as a resource for our association, for our churches, and for the many ministries that are being highlighted across our association. There's so many things that are happening, and we would like to highlight some of those ministries and what's going on. And I've got here with me today two very special guests. They're special friends as well. They're pastors in our association, Pastor John and Pastor David. And we're going to be talking about a resource that they have been a part of for several years, and it's called Reboot Recovery, and it's a recovery program that they are heavily involved in. And I wanted you all to see this, to see what God is doing, how He's using Reboot in our association. I think it's a great resource, and perhaps we'll talk about that some today as we go along and talk about how you can get involved, how you can pray for these pastors and their churches, and how you can be a part of this wonderful ministry. So let's get started. David, friend, how you doing?
Good.
Good. And tell us a little bit about who you are and why you chose to get involved in Reboot.
Hey, it's Pastor David of Sandy Run Baptist Church over in Roxbury, North Carolina. And I was scrolling through Facebook one day and saw a post that was shared by a friend of mine that I was stationed with in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, he shared a memory that he had attended Reboot Recovery. And so I got looking into it and doing some research. And he shared with me his experience as he went through this 12-week trauma healing course and how wonderful it was for him and his family. And God really spoke to me. And I felt led to use this as a resource to help our first responders in our community with the trauma that they have experienced while on the job. They deal with a lot of stuff. A lot of them start out at a young age, and they've been serving in the first responder community, whether volunteers or full-time, for several years. And so I wanted to look into this course and come to find out that it is a faith-based course. And man, it's been wonderful for the last few years.
Awesome. And we're so glad you were involved in that. You mentioned this course is for first responders. John, I know you were involved with first responders in an incredible way, and that's definitely going to be a podcast for another future episode. But tell us a little bit about who you are and why you chose to get involved with Reboot, maybe a little bit of background about also your work with first responders.
Okay. My name is John Thompson. I'm a pastor over at Rich Square Baptist Church. I am also the director of Northampton County Emergency Chaplains. I am a chaplain with our local fire department, as well as I serve as an EMT part-time and I serve EMS, now also dispatch, sheriff's office, lots of different ways, in really the entire first responder community in Northampton County.
Yeah.
And I was familiar with Reboot from hearing David speak about it at some of our pastors' gatherings. There was a couple times we had the opportunity to provide dinner for the Reboot Recovery. I think one of the wonderful things is child care and food is provided for each meeting. And it was a blessing to be able to be part of providing a meal to help that out. As I became more involved with chaplaincy to first responders, I really saw the benefit that the first responder course had. And talking with David, it was a little struggle to get some first responders to be a part of it.
Okay.
But my involvement in that community I saw as an asset to encourage people that I had already built relationships with to come and be a part of the program. And we did my first one this past fall, and we had a great turnout.
Really do.
And a lot of that came from those relationships that God had already begun with those first responders. So I'm still fairly new to the game.
Right.
And so I'm going to rely heavily on David today, but
Absolutely.
I'm glad to be here.
Yes, sir. Thank you, John, for coming. And one thing you may have been hearing as David and John have been talking is the first responders. And this Reboot is a ministry of first responders. David, speak to that just a bit. Who is this Reboot ministry for? If someone were to want to establish a Reboot, I'm not sure the language, the chapter perhaps. Okay. First off, who is this for? And how can they get established, those kinds of things? Speak to that for just a moment.
So what I love about Reboot is for everyone. They have 3 different courses you can run. Each course is 12 weeks long. One course is for first responders, as we have been talking about, and that is a broad range. It is a large range of personnel from 911 dispatchers to EMS to doctors to nurses, anyone who is helping someone else who has experienced or witnessed a traumatic event. Another course that they offer is for military personnel struggling with PTSD. And so they have one for military, retired, they have active duty, anyone who is National Guard, anyone who has served in those roles in the military.
You're a veteran as well.
Yes. Yeah. And we also have a course that is open to everyone. One we've done a couple times is for people who are not first responders, those who are not military, but for just your general population, people who all have experienced a traumatic or witnessed a traumatic event in their lives. Yeah. Statistics show that 2/3 of adults experience childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And so everyone has witnessed or experienced some form of trauma in their life. Yeah. And these courses are available to everyone. Cool. Another course that we've done once is an advanced reboot course. And so there's multiple levels to this. One thing we also found out is even if those who have not served in first responder community but have attended the first responders course still gained a lot of knowledge, tools, and wisdom to help with the symptoms and the side effects of trauma.
Right. A word that keeps coming up, both of you have mentioned, is trauma. Help our viewers understand what trauma is. Maybe if you can go into maybe specifics, and others might help identify even in their own lives. Hey, I've experienced that. I've gone through some trauma, and maybe some of these issues in my life stem from that trauma that I've experienced. So speak to what trauma is, and also perhaps speak to some of the success stories of folks that have worked through their trauma specifically because of Reboot. Either one of you guys is fine.
I'll start off. I think trauma is a hard thing to really nail down, and so I'm going to give my own personal definition. I believe a trauma event is any event that you've been through that has caused a reaction to an abnormal circumstance.
Okay.
So trauma is not something that is a typical everyday thing. It's something that happens that is not of everyday normal human experience. And it is something that heightens your senses, your adrenaline, to a point where you stay heightened for a period of time. PTSD has to do with that not coming back down to anywhere close to normal. Yeah. But most people are still going to have some kind of heightened reaction that may last a day or two. They're going to experience different symptoms, whether it be flashbacks, trouble sleeping, heightened heart rate, things that continue for a period of time in a reaction to something abnormal that has happened.
Sure. And certainly with first responders, they're coming upon scenes and they're seeing a lot of things that are very jolting.
Yeah, and people think first responders see these things all the time, but that's not normal for humanity. Right. They do something that's very abnormal. God's wired them in a way to be able to do that. But still, even the things, and I tell this to some of our first responders, even the things that maybe they've seen many times can affect them differently at different times.
Wow.
And that we talk about in the course, all the things that can add up to cause these really traumatic events. It could just be they're in a high stress situation at home and the added stress of that event was too much.
Yeah.
Or there's something they see that triggers it. One of my personal stories I share is about we went to put out a fire at a house and it was nobody in the house. It was the best scenario in those cases, but there happened to be this blue plastic car bed frame for a little kid that was sitting on the front porch. And I had just put together that exact same frame for my son. Yeah. And I'll never forget that. I'll always remember that bed frame sitting there. I don't remember much else about what was out there at that house, but that sticks to me and things that can trigger traumatic events. That wasn't a traumatic situation for me, but it was still something that stuck with me. And so imagine if there was a child in there who didn't live, who was the same age as my son, who had the same car bed that my son had, that could create a major lasting trauma. But traumas can be from smaller things too, the things that everyone else would see as small that have a big effect on you. So your average citizen can have trauma from things that they see and experience too. I don't want to discount. We never talk about measuring our traumas against each other's.
Wow.
Because in your mind, you might think what happened to me was so small, but that doesn't mean it didn't affect you in a major way.
Right, right.
And one thing we really try to focus on too is trauma is done to us, but sin is done by us.
Mm-hmm.
And so trauma comes into our lives because of, majority of the time, sinful decisions other people have made. And so we're victims of someone else's decision.
Right.
And so we try to take responsibility for that situation when it's not ours to take.
Okay.
And so, like John was saying, it can be anything from the loss of an immediate loss of a loved one. It can be from stress and overworking hours at work, politics at work.
Right.
It can be stuff that just happens. And again, we don't measure our traumas because what may be traumatic to me may be something you experience every day on the job. And so you're just used to it. It doesn't affect you. Everyone is wired differently and handles situations differently. And so we do not judge anyone's trauma. Everyone's traumatic experience is just as important as anyone else's because you handled it in a way that was different than someone else handling it. And sometimes we hide our trauma because we hold it in because we think that I can be as tough or as strong as someone else.
Right.
And I don't want to see as if I'm weak because I can't handle that event as my coworker did or as my supervisor did. And so in order for me to stay on the team, in order for me to not show that I'm weak, I have to hide it. I have to hold it in, and I have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And after a while, we just explode.
Wow. So explain, Reboot is definitely a faith-based program. Explain how Christ is very central to this program. Our relationship with Christ points to the healing that we need. Speak to that for just a moment, how churches and folks are going through trauma. They have many outlets and many ways of trying to deal with it, and our hope is in Christ. Speak to that, how we integrate faith in this program.
So one of the things, we teach them, again, that trauma is done to us, but sin is done by us. And so we have to come to that point. We have to teach them about the forgiveness of sins, how God has forgiven us of our sins, how we are to forgive those who have sinned against us,
Right.
to let go of the hurt,
Wow.
to forgive those that have wronged us. And majority of the time, when people hurt us, they don't even realize they've hurt us. And so we're holding on to some hurt that we can let go of. And so we lead them to understand that God is supreme, God is in control. All things happen, and God has a reason for everything that happens. And those situations, those events are used to pull them closer to Him, to help Him, lean on Him, trust in Him, acknowledge Him, so that He can help them understand their purpose.
Yeah.
To give them purpose through their pain, to show them that what they've gone through can make them stronger
Yeah.
in their faith in Him.
Yeah.
And trusting in Him, relying on Him for strength to forgive those, to forgive others, to keep going.
Yeah.
And John, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I just would say David already mentioned the tide to help people understand that a lot of what happens to us is the result of somebody's sin, whether it's our own sin in the fact that sometimes we make poor decisions that cause us to be in certain situations,
Right.
but that a lot of, again, trauma comes from someone else's sin,
Sure.
someone else's decision that led to the point that you're at that has now affected you in a way that has changed you possibly forever.
Yeah.
And not only does that help us to understand that there was a source point where this comes from, I think it really helps us to understand, too, the effects of our own decisions.
Right.
And a realization, my life was changed because of somebody else's decision, and the decisions I make affect other people's lives, too.
Right. True.
And in a lot of the decisions they make, especially we talk about first responders, those who serve in the military,
Yeah.
they're making the best decision in a very quick moment. and they have to live with those decisions.
Right.
And sometimes that's the difficulty, the decision that they made. But that's not, again, not a normal thing people have to do on a regular basis.
Right. True.
And so we have to have a little grace
Right.
with ourselves, and they have to trust their training. If you did what you were supposed to do,
Yeah, that's right.
then you've done the right thing.
Kind of on that note, helping people understand God's will. And we can't change God's will. We just do, like John said, what we're trained to do.
Yeah.
And we can't prevent God's will from happening. And so we can just do our best. And it's how to take that traumatic event and use it for good. And so one of my stories is the stoplight in Oak City going to Greenville. I'm terrified of that stoplight.
Right.
But that's the only stoplight I'm terrified of. I'll get all the way to Interstate 64 and have to turn around if I don't remember going through that stoplight. And so I'll be almost to Interstate 64, and I'll turn around, go all the way back to Oak City, go through the stoplight again because I didn't remember if it was red, green, or yellow the first time I went through it.
Yeah.
And so I'll go down the hill, and I'll turn around, and I'll go back through the light, and I'll look at it, and I'll see a green light and go through it. And I'll look in my rear view,
Right.
green light.
Yeah.
I started looking at it differently because when I was 17 years old, I had a traumatic event that happened to me in Oak City.
Yeah.
And so now, instead of looking at it as a bad thing, I look at it as a memory of God's grace in my life.
Yeah.
Because it was there that he changed my life. He stepped in and rescued me from a situation I had put myself in because of sinful decisions.
Sure.
And God rescued me at that moment, and my life changed at that moment.
Yeah.
And so now that stoplight is a remembrance of God's grace.
Amen.
And so now I'm no longer afraid of that stoplight.
Yeah.
But rather I praise God at that stoplight.
And David, you hit on something I think I want to dial in on, and that is the effects of God's grace and how God is using Reboot to show his grace in people's lives and how they can move on and deal with the trauma, to deal with the decisions that they've made, regret, if you will, or whatever's hanging out. They're not letting it go, those kinds of things. Let's pivot, if we can briefly. We got a few more minutes here. What success stories have you guys seen in your leadership through Reboot? I know we can't use names, those kinds of things, but just looking 30,000-foot view, what are some of the highlight, the mountaintop experiences you've seen God use in people's lives because they chose to take part in, I think it's a 12-week program through Reboot?
It is.
What are some of the highlights that you guys have seen? Let's start with you.
Week 11 of the course, the participants in the first responders course are asked to share their stories.
Yeah.
That is an emotional night, a very emotional night. And just the fact that they have the courage to stand up in front of a group of people that they've learned to trust over the last 11 weeks. It is a very secure, very safe place that we try to create this atmosphere that anything we speak of in that class stays in that class. We don't share outside the course. We don't share stories or events outside of the course. But for them to stand up, and for most of them, the first time they have ever shared that event with anyone.
Wow.
And the mountaintops that they have overcome over the last 11 weeks. I had one participant several classes ago who did not prepare a story. He did not have a story prepared. He was not prepared to share a story. But as we ran around the room, he was, I think, the last one to go. And I looked at him, and he stood up and shared his story for, I think it was 20 minutes.
Wow. Of
how when he stood up, he was not going to share a story. He was going to simply stand up, say his name, and sit down. And after 20 minutes, he explained of how angry he's been at God because of things that happened to his friends on deployments, things that have happened in his life. And now going through this course, how that wall has been moved because he has seen God's grace in his life, protecting him for a greater purpose.
Right.
And so he's no longer mad at God, but rather he's thanking God that God saved him and rescued him from those situations to use him for something else.
Yeah.
And so he sees God in a totally different view. And he sees his trauma that he's experienced, and so many of them have, as something good. How God can take something so bad and use it for his purpose.
That's good. Yeah.
And so that's my part.
John, anything highlights?
Yeah, I would just say people who came to the class thinking they were going to, I had a few who thought they were going to do it so that they would better know how to help their peers,
Yeah.
only to realize that they had a lot of baggage that they had never really noticed or dealt with.
Right.
The program kind of starts some with the symptoms of things that
Okay.
you feel, reactions
Yeah.
that you have, and all of a sudden you're going, oh wow, I never realized that might be from trauma.
Yeah.
And then it gets down into the root of the cause of that and
Right.
the things that may have affected you.
Mm.
We didn't mention this before. I want to mention it and tie it into
Yeah.
this question.
Yeah.
It is also for spouses.
Mm.
Yes.
So we had a lot of first responders who brought their wives. And one of the parts of trauma we talked about is the trauma that you get from always hearing and being a part of somebody else's trauma.
Wow. Yeah.
That first responder who is, or our military or whoever who is dealing with great amounts of trauma, and they come home and the spouse feels that,
Yeah.
wasn't there, doesn't know the details, doesn't know how to help,
Wow.
and that can actually cause traumatic
Oh, yeah.
events too in the life of the spouse. And so it really, I think, helps marriages too when they're willing to come together and maybe start to understand each other on a different level for
Right.
the first time, for the spouse to realize what the first responder's been through,
Yeah.
and for the first responder to realize how that's affected the spouse.
Awesome.
And as John talked about the spouse, let me touch on this.
Okay, please.
because
Yes.
The spouses they don't think what they've experienced is as bad as what their spouse experienced. Their first responder has experienced. The first responder comes home from work, had a hard day at work. The spouse also had a traumatic event that day, or had things they were dealing with, a sick child or school, trying to help with homework, trying to get dinner cooked, whatever the case is.
Right.
And so when the first responder comes home and had a bad day, the spouse measures their trauma against the spouse's trauma, and they don't share it. They just hold it in. Mine's not as bad as what they experienced today, so I'll just deal with this later.
Wow.
And then the first responder is holding theirs in. And so it's just, for the marriage, it's just built on trauma.
Right.
And they're just dealing with trauma the best they can. And it affects marriages, and it affects the relationships with your children. And so it helps them, the spouses, be able to communicate to one another, to understand. Again, we're not judging, we're not measuring trauma.
Right.
We're going to be here for each other.
Amen.
I'm going to share with you, and now you know how to help me. And now when I come home, I know how to help you
Right.
and be
Excellent.
here for you
That's
at
good.
the same time.
Yeah.
And it's done some wonders
Awesome.
in marriages
Wow.
as well.
That's great. Guys, thank you so much for this. We're going to wrap it up. Are there any concluding thoughts you guys might have for those watching about this ministry? It's really a ministry,
It is.
right? And that's a ministry that's, I think, is done well within our association. But there are more churches out there. There are more first responders out there, military, just folks that are just dealing with trauma. What would you say to them? How can they get started? They're just at square one. What they do? What's the next step for them if they say, hey, maybe this is me. I acknowledge I've got trauma in my life, effects of trauma. I want some help. What do they do next?
Well, it's a great question. Let's see.
David, if you want to speak to what churches can do, and I'll speak to
Yeah,
first responders.
that'd be great.
In
Please.
terms of a resource, like a website they can go to,
Yeah.
classes, those kinds of things that are being offered in our area, maybe the next semester or so.
I got you. Yeah. Go ahead, John.
To first responders out there, I want you to understand that you have been through stuff that normal people don't go through, and that's okay. It's okay that you react differently, whether that's you handle yourself in a different way, you don't get upset, you don't show emotion. That is also a sign of trauma in your life. If you get emotional, you never have before, but that one call made a difference. That's something you've got to deal with. And this is a wonderful program for you to come and to be with other people who have experienced similar things, not the same thing, but similar things, and to help each other to get through this. We do everything we do as first responders together As a team, we rely on each other. We need to do the same thing when it comes to dealing with trauma in our lives. We need to be able to rely on each other, to come together as a team, and to find real healing, not just to put it down, not just to compartmentalize it, but to actually deal with it. And I want to encourage you, if you're a first responder, consider doing this course. I think it will help you more than you know that it will.
Amen. David?
Yes, and please bring your spouses, bring your children.
Mm-hmm.
We, like John said earlier, we provide a meal. And it's 12 weeks long. It's about 2 hours once a week. We provide you a wonderful meal. Churches in our association cook some wonderful meals, provide wonderful meals. And so we want to invite you to come out, have a meal with your family. We'll have childcare available for your children so they can go and work on homework or anything they need to do. They can work on that stuff while you're in the class. Churches, if you have first responders in your community within the walls of your church, this is a great ministry to minister to your first responders in your community. And if you would be willing to host one of these courses in your community, please let me know. Get with me. I would love to talk with you about it and the steps we need to take in order to make it successful. One of the biggest hurdles that we face is time.
Yeah.
A lot of our first responders are volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have full-time jobs. They're volunteering. A lot of our first responders are working in multiple counties. And so they're still working 5-6 days a week in different counties. And so finding time is tough. But if you would dedicate 2 hours a week for 12 weeks, it will make a difference. And what I love about Reboot is if you miss a class, it's okay. The courses are online,
Yeah.
so you can
Awesome.
catch up while you're sitting in your ambulance. You can catch up while you're sitting in the waiting room, whatever. You can work on these classes on your own and then get caught back up the following week when you are able to come to class. And so just make time for it. Churches, please, if you would love to host this in your church, and we can get churches in your community to provide meals and childcare, it is a great ministry, great opportunity to help those first responders and
Awesome.
others in your community.
Do we have any Reboot programs coming up, or is that something we're looking forward to?
So I'm glad you asked. Yep, I just spoke with John a little bit earlier. We're looking to hopefully put on another first responders course in Rich Square this spring.
Okay.
We're also potentially looking at hosting one in Bertie County
Okay.
this spring as well. And there's multiple opportunities to do this and multiple resources out there to do this. Also, if you would like to, you can go to rebootrecovery.com
Okay.
and you can watch testimonials. People will give their testimonies online. You can watch those. You can also sign up for an online course. And so there's a lot of people out there that host this course online.
Wow.
And so you can do it in your home. You can do it on your phone.
Wow.
You can attend these classes online through Zoom
Yeah.
and take these classes. And so there's multiple opportunities to attend this class in person and online. And so we're looking to have hopefully 2 courses running this spring.
Great. That's excellent. And so we'll have those links available to you in the comments where you can go and get in touch with us at the association, David or John. And they'd love to speak to you about being a part of this wonderful ministry called Reboot Recovery. Hey, thank you so much for joining us today for our podcast, and subscribe and just get the word out about what's going on, what God's doing in the West Shawan Baptist Association. We'd love to highlight you or your ministry or what God is doing in your church. Hey, pray for Reboot, pray for the participants involved, pray for John and David as they lead their churches and lead Reboot well. We love you. God bless you. And we hope to have another podcast. We're going to try to post every Monday. So look for our next episode coming up soon. God bless you all. Thank you so much.